boy! The time is here to figure out what our favorite books were that we read over the last year. It is so hard to pick your favorites, and sometimes I feel like I've read books where I'm like, it was really good, but it just didn't stick with me as much. Sometimes it's just because you have a personal connection with the book. I feel like there's so many different reasons why stuff ends up in your top 10. I had a bit of a weird reading year. I read quite a few books that left me kind of like meh, but there was definitely a selection that I really enjoyed. Stuff that I've been wanting to get around to for forever. Stuff that sort of jumped out as a surprise. So without further ado, here's my top 10. First of all, there's a book that I mentioned in my currently reading video with Rosanna, and it is Hot Little Hands by Abigail Ullman. So these are 8 short stories about young girls and women, and about the power that comes with being a young woman and discovering your sexuality, and also the dark side of it and the threat that comes with it. I read this mostly in one sitting. I read it as I was on a train back into London. This cover really reminds me of Lolita. There were some likable characters, there were some not so likable characters, and I felt like it was a bit of a like fiction look into some of the non-fiction that I'm reading at the moment as well. Also, some of these girls I just wanted to give a hug. It really also just reminds you of how unprepared you are to be a teenager. That is the first one. Then the second one is one that I read pretty close towards the end of the year, and it is Paper Girls. This is like Bind Up Volume 1. It is set in the 80s. It is about girls that have this paper round and then all hell breaks loose. There's aliens, there's time travel. The coloring in this, the drawings are absolutely gorgeous. I found the pace to be really nice. It is a bit like crazy and all over the place, but I think if you love Stranger Things, then this is something to check out. I think it would also be like a really good introduction to comics. Last year I read a couple of comics where I loved the style of it, but I just couldn't get into the characters or the story at all, and this for me is a combination of all the good things. The next one is one that has a fun story attached to it. So I did some videos in collaborations with the Bailey's Prize, and I was gonna read all the books, and there was one that I didn't get around to. And of course, when we went to the ceremony, that is the one that won. So I figured I couldn't stay behind and had to dig into this. I actually chose to listen to the audiobook, and it was amazing. It is probably one of my ultimate favorites from this year. It is set in Cork, and the accent of the lady that read the audiobook was fantastic. It is about a dad and his mother and his son and like all the people in the circle around it. It kind of takes place in the underworld of Cork, but also just kind of in impoverished neighborhoods. There's a classic thing of like people being murdered to keep them quiet, but there's also day-to-day desperation and love. This was fantastic. I really enjoyed it, and I don't think I would have picked this up. Didn't think this was for me, but it was great. Then next up I have some YA fantasy. It is, not surprisingly, Goldenhand by Garth Nix. I think for the last couple of years, whenever a Old Kingdom book has come out, it has been in my top 10 list. I love Garth Nix. Introduces a new character, which I loved. I don't think it's my favorite of the whole series, but I just gobbled it up. If you like fantasy, 100% check this out. My next favorite is one that I don't have here, but I'll pop an image up so you can see what it looks like. It is Nina Is Not Okay by Shappi Khorsandi. This is one that I'd heard so much about, and it's sort of in the genre of Louise O'Neill's Asking for It. But a teenage girl, she doesn't really get on with her mom that much. She's still grieving the loss of her dad, and she sort of realizes that she might have an alcohol problem. And then what also happens is that she goes to a nightclub. Something happens, she can't really remember, but as the reader, you know what's happened. It's about her trying to deal with that realization and spiraling completely out of control. It's a weird mix of being like really appropriate for a YA audience, but also being like quite extreme and graphic. It is a great book. I read it in like one go. I also listened to the Penguin podcast where she talks about her life and growing up and where she drew inspiration from her own life for this story, so that's really interesting as well if you want to check it out. Potentially my favorite book of the year is Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson. Now, I had heard so much about this beforehand, had never really picked it up myself, and I actually listened to the audiobook for this one as well, and it's read by Jeanette Winterson herself, and it is fantastic. This is about a young girl called Jeanette who is adopted by this evangelical Christian family, and she's basically raised to be a missionary. And it's not really until she gets to school that she sort of realizes that maybe her family is like slightly different from the other kids' families. Everything in her life is sort of in the very extreme about the Bible and things like that. And also when she's a teenager, she realizes that she is a lesbian, which doesn't go over that well. This book is like kind of bizarre and funny and a bit heartbreaking. I would recommend this for like any kind of reader. And it was also my first Jeanette Winterson, so I'm gonna read some more. Another one that I don't have here, but I'll insert some footage on top of this, is Space Dumplings by Greg Thompson. Greg Thompson is an amazing graphic novelist. Is that what they're called? I love everything he's done. This one is in color, which is unusual for him, but he basically worked with someone who did the coloring. It's about a little girl who lives in space and her parents are having a bit of a hard time money-wise, job-wise, and with their marriage. Then one day when her dad goes missing and there's like this natural disaster that happens in space, all to do with space whales, she goes out with this unlikely bunch of companions and tries to save him. It was so lovely and witty and funny, and I read it on a train journey. This would be really, really good for younger readers as well as older ones. Then I'm gonna combine these two, even though they're like quite different, but they're in the same series. They're the Hogarth Shakespeare series. I've talked about this a lot on my channel, so sorry if you've already heard me talk about this a couple of times. It's Vinegar Girl by Anne Tyler and Hag-Seed by Margaret Atwood. My first Margaret Atwood. These are sort of modern adaptations of Shakespeare plays. This is The Taming of the Shrew, this is The Tempest. This one was just such a delight to read. I really enjoyed it. I wanted more, and I also really want to read the original play just to see how these two interlink. And then I have this battered copy of Hag-Seed, with the main character being a theatre director who's sort of been duped by a colleague and booted out, who then takes years and years and years to plot his revenge. Okay, I think this is number 10. My last one is probably not a surprise to most of you. It is the new Isabel Greenberg, 100 Nights of Hero. I love Isabel Greenberg. This, like the Encyclopedia of Early Earth, has everything I want in a graphic novel. The paper is gorgeous, the colors are vibrant, I love all the illustrations. It is always so witty and self-aware and beautiful and sad and just many, many good words. The one thing that I sometimes find hard is to read the like smaller text at the top, but this is great and I just want to give it to everyone. If you like folktales, if you like epic stories, check this out. So those are my top 10 books I read in 2016. I hope you will take some of these recommendations and read them in 2017. If you want to keep track of my reading, you can follow me on Goodreads. You can also find me on Snapchat, Instagram, Twitter, Patreon, all under Books and Quills. I hope you guys have a good reading year. I'd love to know which is your ultimate book or your top 10 that you read this year in the comments, and I'll talk to you guys later. Doei!